Well, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from in the world. Welcome to the live insight session here at Mina Partners called the new CCPA Regulations, What You Need to Know. My name is Dave Cohen. I'm a director here at Mina Partners, and I'll be your host for today's program. We're going to get started with conversation in just a minute, but before we do, I'd like to share a few program details with you. We'd like this to be an interactive event, so please feel free to post your questions at any time in the comments panel, and we'll get to those throughout the discussion as we can. We'll be taking the questions both throughout the presentation and during a dedicated few minutes toward the end of the program as appropriate. So with that, let me now cover the agenda for today's program. In just a minute, I will welcome our panel guests today and provide some introductions for you. And then we're going to go over why we're here, what the topic is that we're going to be covering during the program. And then we're going to take a slightly deeper dive into a short history and the context of the CCPA and its regulations. For those of you that are relatively new to the statute and its requirements, we'll cover the basis of the law and scope, the major obligations, regulatory agency, what it is and its authority. So we'll give you an overview on that. And then we're going to go into the important practical requirements from an operational perspective. In other words, how do we translate the requirements of the law into actual processes and procedures within your organization? And we'll take a deep dive into that. And we're going to cover three main areas using automated decision-making technology, conducting cybersecurity audits, and performing risk assessments. And then, as I mentioned just a moment ago, we'll save some time toward the end of the program to take your questions. So if you have questions, again, please post them in the comments and we'll take them as we can. So with that, let's move on. And I'd like to introduce today's panelists. Corey Gant is my fellow colleague here at Mina Partners and a director as well. Corey, can you tell us a little bit about your Center of Excellence, your background, and give the folks a little bit about your areas of expertise?
Sure. Thank you, Dave. So as mentioned, I manage Mina Partners Cybersecurity and Compliance practice, and I've been in this position for 3 years, but consulting for 9. And prior to that, I spent about the same amount of time, a decade, as in internal audit as an IT auditor. So I've always got assessments and audits top of mind, and I hope I can provide some insights around the new requirement for the CCPA.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Corey. And thanks for making some time out of your busy day to join us on the program today. I really appreciate it. And joining Corey on the panel, Tara Cho is a partner and chair of the Privacy and Cybersecurity practice at Womble Bond & Dickinson. She works out of the Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina area. And Tara, welcome. It's great to have you with us today, and we really appreciate you taking some time to be with us too. Can you tell us a little bit about your practice and your areas of expertise?
Yes, thank you, Dave, and thanks to all the participants. Happy to be here. As I'm sure anyone who's listening can appreciate, it's sort of a thrilling and stressful time to be working in this area of compliance. But as you noted, I chair the firm's privacy and cybersecurity team, and I'm one of the co-leads of the AI practice. And all of these regulations and some tensions at the state and federal level of conflicting postures make for definitely an interesting time and good job security. So happy to be here to talk about it today.
Absolutely. Yes, for all of us, Tara, for sure. Some important new regulations and requirements for businesses, which we're going to get into in depth in just a minute. So with that, let's move on. And I want to provide just kind of a brief overview of the topic. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the CCP regulations have been in draft for a number of years now. There's been several public comment periods, opportunities for businesses and individuals to weigh in with their thoughts and comments on how the regulation should be drafted. And finally, just as of July of this year, they have been finalized. I think there may be one more administrative step within the state of California to get them actually into law, although they essentially are, as written, are going to go into force. Some of them at the beginning of next year, and there'll be a grace period of about a year, which we'll cover the timelines in a moment. And but the time definitely to become aware of these new obligations is now, and to really study them in depth and see how they're going to affect your business. So We're going to go into depth in 3 areas today. The first one being using automated decision-making technology. Companies must now disclose their ADMT use and offer opt-outs, just as with a data subject access request that have been in place for some time with the CCPA. And they need to ensure human oversight in significant decisions. And there are some guidelines about what constitutes a significant decision, which we're going to talk about in a moment as well. So that's one of the areas we're going to cover. Then we're going to get into some depth on conducting cybersecurity audits, exactly what is spelled out in terms of the needs there, and how companies should go about preparing for and enacting these audits. There are some significant IT security controls that need to be looked at and perhaps put into place if they're not already. So Corey's going to cover that section for us. And then we're going to finish with a section on performing risk assessments, which hopefully many of you as privacy and IT security professionals are well aware of. But there are some new requirements within the statute that are different and new regarding high-risk processing. So we're going to talk about those and exactly what those are and what might be the net new in terms of what you have been doing in terms of your risk assessments that you already have in place. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the short history and context of the CCPA and regulations. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Tara.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I'm not going to go into every turn and curve of the legislative path, but the initial CCPA was enacted in 2018, shortly after the GDPR went into effect. And a lot of folks at that time likened the 2 laws, even though there are some key distinctions around jurisdictional considerations and applicability. Part of the issue at the time when the CCPA took effect is some of the extraordinary manners in which laws are enacted in California, and so that was sort of up against the clock to bring this law into fruition. And since it was enacted, was subject to several amendments and also took great advantage of the rulemaking authority. So unlike many of the states where we have these comprehensive privacy laws and there is no rulemaking authority, California and a couple others that have that authority have much more detailed prescriptive parameters on how to implement the requirements of the statutory requirements. And that has continued to evolve. There have been lots of proposed amendments, not all of them landed. And then again, with the various rulemaking, as you can see through these timelines. But just to sort of level set for anyone who might be newer to this space, the middle column here indicates the threshold triggers for the CCPA, which, as you can see, are tied to gross annual revenue. That's not limited to just revenue in California, but globally being at or above 25 million. And then the other 2 parameters are really focusing on the volume of data, personal data that you're collecting from residents of California, which for purposes of this law uniquely also includes B2B data, employees, job applicants, and usually the big catch-all for high volume are website visitors if you're using pixels and other online tracking technology. So ruling out applicability based on this second bullet alone can sometimes be difficult if you are unable to generally sort of broad stroke quantify that website visitor bucket. And not every organization has that ability to really calculate, and others will go ahead and take the approach if it's unclear to try to comply with these requirements. And then the last trigger, and it just has to be one of these to trigger the law, is that you derive 50% or more annual revenue from selling that data. And again, the selling and sharing can be through very common tactics of targeted advertising and behavioral ads. So it's important to keep in mind that when assessing applicability for California, it may not be possible to have a bright line. This definitely doesn't apply to us unless you're a nonprofit. But increasingly, it would be difficult to take a state-by-state approach on applicability too if you have any type of meaningful online presence to try to gate that. And we could talk about that more, but I mostly wanted to sort of socialize the concept that yes, California was at the forefront of these state comprehensive privacy laws, but what we're going to talk about today with the current regulations focused on cybersecurity audits, ADMT, and risk assessments are not new concepts. And many of the principles that these new regulations bring to light are things that a lot of organizations are probably already doing to varying degrees. But we'll try to keep the conversation clear in case these are entirely new, because for some of you listening, you may be in a regulated industry where you're used to having to do risk assessments or documented cyber audits in some form or fashion. But again, just want to emphasize that it's nothing to be overwhelmed by or scared about. It just takes some careful planning and budgeting and of time and resources to just document more formally things that are likely already happening, because you would have to do some of these things in concept, or some of the components in concept, in order to comply with the law as it's already written today. Again, just as a refresher, these are some of the key requirements under the CCPA, which are very similar across all of the other states with comprehensive privacy laws. The main focus of these laws is really on consumer protection. Again, California is distinct in its applicability to B2B contacts and employees. But the other kicker for California is that private right of action, which we won't dwell on today. But really, if you think about the new regulations, it's focused on consumer protections and transparency. So the requirements speak to giving notice in advance of conducting certain high-risk activities or activities that leverage fully automated decision-making, and also giving the opportunity for consumers to make choices about that. So again, if you think about the GDPR and other laws in parallel to the CCPA, the underlying principles, as cliche as it might sound, about privacy by design and really thinking about building in transparency will really carry you a long way, no matter which of these regimes you're trying to comply with. The introduction of this newest set of regulations does present some more ongoing obligations through the risk assessments and the security audits, and less of a, okay, we updated our privacy notice, check, we've completed that, but more ongoing affirmative requirements. And here, of course, is the stick that comes with these challenges and potential non-compliance. I won't read it aloud, but it's very clear that the enforcement agency, the CCPA, the California AG, and as well as many other state AGs are very focused on these new privacy laws and protecting consumers in their states. And so while every state doesn't have its own dedicated enforcement body like California and Texas and others, it is clear that the allocation of resources is focused on this area of enforcement and scrutiny. You can see the potential fines there. There have been lots of CCPA related settlements that are high dollar. There's also a lot of litigation associated with sort of intersecting concepts with California privacy law and older wiretap laws that can become very costly, even if you're settling them and not actually trying to litigate them. We also know, and I think we're going to talk about that shortly, there's now also a coordinated effort, which the CCPA just announced this week, where the CCPA, the California AG, and the AGs of Colorado and Connecticut are doing an investigative sweep to identify websites that don't honor global privacy controls and opt-out mechanisms. So all that to say, the regulations we're going to talk about today are not uncommon concepts, and generally regulated spaces that have sensitive or personal information. but it will present, I think, another avenue of pretty black and white ability to scrutinize and assess from the regulator side, much more similar than to the regulated industries. In other words, if you don't have the security audit to provide on request in response to a consumer complaint or a data breach, that's pretty black and white. They can compute then the penalties for that. And so, again, unlike other states, they're going to have an opportunity for enforcement here that I don't think that the authorities are going to shy away from.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that, Tara. And speaking of the CPPA, I had the privilege of listening to a great interview the other day with Tom Kemp, who's the new executive director of the CPPA. He was being interviewed by Trevor Hughes, who's the president and CEO of the IAPP. And one of the questions that Trevor asked Tom Kemp was, what surprised you when you came over to the CPPA? And that's because, interestingly, Tom Kemp comes from private industry, from Silicon Valley, and has worked in technology businesses. So he's a technologically savvy professional. And he said one of the things that surprised him when he came over to the agency was the technological sophistication of the agency and the number of people that had really good technical skills as well as legal skills. And so just for everybody watching, please understand that this is not a dusty agency trying to come up to speed technologically, but instead an agency that really understands the latest uses of technology. And so with that segue over to our next section, which is the important practical requirements from an operational perspective on ADMT, or using automated decision-making technology. So if we can go to the next slide, kind of the top level highlights that folks need to know is that this was approved by the CPPA on July 24th, 2025, and the enforcement is going to begin 2027. So there is some time to prepare, but some of these new obligations will take some time to put into place. So it's not too early to get started by any stretch of the imagination. And then just at a top level, what is automated decision-making technology? Well, it's in the statute, it's defined as technology that replaces or substantially replaces human decision-making. So using personal data. So as you might imagine, that covers a lot of different technology systems and is a rather broad scope for the definition of ADMT. So best to be on the conservative side when you're evaluating your internal systems that might fall under this definition. And importantly, it applies to decisions that are impacting employment, housing, credit, healthcare, education, insurance, or access to what are defined as essential goods. So these categories are important. Quick question for you, Tara. Are you aware, does the legislation limit the scope of the law to just these categories, or might it extend to some others? And how might you counsel clients in thinking about it if they have some other processing that doesn't fall within these distinct categories, but still might seem like a high risk processing activity?
Yeah, I think you just have to focus on the short answer is yes, I think it would extend beyond those specific examples. And in fact, I was going to mention that almost all of the categorical decisions listed are already regulated by existing laws.
Right.
For instance, determining creditworthiness or sort of automated pilfering through employment applications and similar is already regulated, as you can imagine. It has been for a long time to prevent discrimination and bias. These are also concepts that have been long-standing regulated under the GDPR with the same principles of transparency and understanding for the data subjects. But really, even outside of these specific examples, as was seen in the existing regulations, the emphasis is on automated decision-making that presents an important legal decision or significantly similar decision for the data subject. And that's going to be consistent across some of the other states as well that call out that type of automation. Probably not going to, at least for near term, wrap in using that information for things like deciding what ads are presented to a website visitor, which is also done through automation. Unless you were somehow using things like race or ethnicity and sensitive data to
Right.
do that automation. It's really focusing on what is the decision that's being made and how meaningful and significant that is to the individual.
So I'm really glad you brought up that last point, Tara, that so importantly, there is a carve out for targeted advertising. So that's not in general being within the scope here. However, if it is using sensitive information, you want to take a hard look at that and do some risk analysis internally to make sure that you are not going to be caught within that category. So as you can see in the scope includes column to the right there, machine learning models, rule-based scoring systems, facial recognition, advanced spreadsheets with decision-making impact. These are all things that you'd be hard-pressed to find organizations who are not utilizing these systems for making some of these decisions. So pretty broad scope from a technical standpoint of what this is. And then if moving on to the next slide, you can see what is required for the use of these systems within your business and what you're going to be required to do in broad strokes here in these 4 columns. So to start, pre-use notice is huge. So the statute asks businesses to disclose ADMT use and privacy notices prior to the high-risk processing activity. So you can imagine this in fast-moving businesses that are rapidly evolving and changing. This is going to be perhaps a big cultural change. So a new ability to process information, a new technology emerges that a business is evaluating. They decide they want to move forward with utilizing that technology. Notice needs to be provided to consumers prior to the use of that technology. And then moving on to the next column with an opt-out mechanism. So they must have some ability to request that instead of using the automated technology, that a person, a real human is going to review that decision. And so that is a new right that is open to California residents to be able to request that. For instance, using the example of an important credit scoring and determining a mortgage or health insurance, other kind of really important life decisions, California consumers are going to be able to request that an alternate decision-making process involving a person is put into place. So that's going to be a big change within organizations. Consumers are going to be able to have access rights upon request. The businesses are going to have systems in place to explain the logic behind the ADMT use. This, when I was reading this and researching this, the quote, the term black box of AI and other technologies, how does this logic actually work? Well, there's going to need to be some plain language descriptions and explanations of how that processing is affecting the decision, what those output details were, and how the outputs influenced the decision making. So you can imagine for even one process, this would be a pretty big lift, let alone multiple processes within organizations. So that's going to require some real important internal analysis and documentation for businesses to be ready for this requirement. Lastly,
sorry, Dave, if I could just chime in there.
Yeah.
It's all what's in a name, right? So yeah. We're talking about ADMT, but if we wanted to, we could swap out AI and make an AI regulation. It's sort of more challenging to move forward legislation that's a purely AI policy-driven law, but lots of states are taking the same approach with automated decision-making. But everything you just described on this slide would be components of an AI governance program as well. It's just that it's not generative AI, and we're talking about a little different use case, but the concepts are all the same. So again, organizations that have carried that lift forward and trying to contain shadow AI, where HR might be using one thing and marketing another, et cetera, this can bring it all together to try to prevent the unexpected black box outcomes where it's like, well, this is common practice. We've been using this tool for, a decade or more. Just having that wholesome view for AI governance overall.
100%. It's going to be very interesting to see exactly how businesses attempt to satisfy this requirement. Are they going to be posting explanations on web pages, providing, PDFs to consumers, et cetera? It'll be very interesting to see how this gets rolled out. But to your point, there isn't a progressive business out there right now that's not adopting AI tools for productivity within their walls. And so there's a lot of documentation, proof, and explanation is going to have to be coming, and it's going to be should be a real challenge. And yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, because I almost wonder if the consumer base will be desensitized by this, because at first it's probably going to sound pretty scary if you give a detailed description of what's happening with your data, even though this has been happening again for decades. I wonder if it will become like many privacy disclosures anyway, that they just click through because they want to get to the technology and the functionality they want. But
it's a good point. You're right. And are we going to get notice fatigue? Terms and conditions. I'm going to take the time to read through all of those. It will be interesting to see what the actual real world results of this requirement end up being. And then in this last column here, conducting risk assessments for high impact use cases. Hopefully organizations are already doing this. When I was reading through this, I just kept thinking of what privacy professionals have been familiar with for years, a PIA, a privacy impact assessment. Seems to me this is a very similar requirement. And we're going to get into detail in just a moment with cybersecurity audit requirements. So to finish up here, what do we recommend organizations do both immediately and long term? One of the most important things you can do, and this has been our recommendation for a while here at Mina Partners, is just inventory your ADMT use across the organization. Try to get your arms around where that technology is being used. It's going to take a lot of discovery calls within different departments. We're helping our clients with a lot of this work right now. Updating your privacy policies and consumer-facing disclosures. You probably already have DSAR workflows in place, but you're going to need to modify them to somewhat to include these options to have human review protocols, and get ready for those data access requests and tweaking them as necessary in your processes. And then for longer term planning, cybersecurity auditors, you're going to want to have somebody to work with as a third party if you don't already. You're going to want to, as Tara just mentioned, develop these governance frameworks internally if you haven't done that yet. And keep an eye on the CCPA and future updates and where they're going. So with that, let me move on and hand it over to Corey to tackle conducting cybersecurity audits. Corey, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. Next slide, please. So the first step in approaching the CCPA cybersecurity audit is to determine if you're even in scope for it. So a business that's processing CPI or consumers' personal information presents a significant risk to the consumer's security, has to complete an annual cybersecurity audit if 50% or more of its annual revenues from selling or sharing CPI, or had gross annual revenues in excess of $25 million. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, and process personal information of 250,000 or more consumers or households in the prior year, or process the sensitive personal information of 50,000 or more consumers in the preceding calendar year. So you can see that in this slide and in the next one, there is a risk-based approach to the cybersecurity audit. So if you determine that your organization is in scope, or near to be, or soon anticipated to be in scope, here's a little bit of insight into the timing requirements. The good news is that it's not immediate. Things are still, to my last check, Dave, still not completely finalized. But that should come shortly. So they are giving in-scope organizations a tiny bit of breathing room, and they've broken out the initial audit timeline into 4 buckets. So starting in the bucket in the upper left, so a business would need to complete their first cybersecurity audit no later than April 1st, 2028, if that business had annual gross revenue in 2026 that was more than $100 million. one thing to note, as I just very quickly go through all of these, I won't go into terrible detail on all of them, but one thing I do want to know, because we'll touch on it in another slide, is the cadence of these audits. So it's from January 1 of a given year through January 1 of the next year, and you have to have that audit report completed, which implies you have to have the assessment and all other work done by April 1st. So that really only gives the organization 3 months to get it done, if assuming the work is started on January 1st. So the next bucket would be April 1st, 2029, if the business's gross annual revenue was between 50 million and 100 million, and it would cover the prior year, would be the scope for that. April 1st would be the completion date. If the business's annual gross revenue for 2028 was less than $50 million. And again, that scope would be for the prior year. And then after those three buckets, the general cadence would be April 1st of any given year. So it's an annual, just to confirm, it's an annual cybersecurity assessment. It would cover the prior January through January as well. Next slide, please. So we'll talk just really quickly about the thoroughness and independence of the cybersecurity audit. This is all, I did list the section numbers here in case anybody wants to go back directly to reference this in a little bit more detail, but a business has to use a qualified, objective, and independent professional auditor for all work. They have to, he or she or they has to have knowledge of cybersecurity and how to audit a business's cybersecurity program. And the auditor may be internal or external to the business, but has to exercise an objective and impartial judgment without influence by the audit targets. Not uncommon. Moving over to the next column, if the business is going to use an internal resource, the highest ranking auditor must report directly to a member of the business's executive management, so it cannot be related to cyber. Cybersecurity audit findings must rely primarily on evidence that's gathered and that the auditor deems appropriate. And please do note that all evidence, documentation, reports, certifications have to be kept for a minimum of 5 years, but I would suggest longer than that, but that is the minimum requirement.
Corey, if I could jump in, just for those listening who are familiar with GDPR concepts as well, just because I think it's helpful when you're considering the appointment of a DPO as well. There's a lot of guidance under the GDPR about that independence and function. And I think that's the same flavor that they're going for in these regulations. So you don't want the same person auditing who is responsible for implementing those security requirements in a way that they couldn't have an independent impression, and also the ability to give like true findings or observations. And so that separation, I think, is key, but not, again, not a completely foreign concept.
Great. Thank you for the insight, Tara. That's great. So a little bit more about the scope and the audit report. The audit must assess and document how the business's cybersecurity program protects personal information from unauthorized access, destruction, use, modification, or disclosure, and protects against unauthorized activity resulting in the loss of availability. I did underline some of those terms because it did occur to me trying to aggregate these different terms, what they're trying to get at. And when you look at access, destruction, modification, and even availability, it does remind me of the classic CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So that's at its core. But they do actually also mention use and disclosure, which in assessment world and assessment talk denotes some privacy. So it appears to me that it's your classic cybersecurity controls, as well as any other controls that support data privacy. The cybersecurity audit must assess whether the program is appropriate to the business's size and complexity, and the nature and scope of the processing activities. And on the right, I no need to run through all of these bullets, but I did just want to give you an opportunity to take a look at, or if you want to download the presentation as well after, the assessment topics. These are a very typical suite of cybersecurity topics and or controls. And I did do a really quick reconciliation against some of the other assessment frameworks that we work with at MINA, like NIST CSF, ISO, even SOC 2, the trust services criteria. Regarding the cybersecurity, the NIST CSF cybersecurity framework, there were two topics that were not represented here, which I thought might be interesting to call out. One is the newly included governance function in the NIST CSF version 2.0. It also not listed here is risk assessment. So the process of risk assessment and risk management is also not specifically mentioned here. And then also physical security was not listed here. So interesting to note that the NIST CSF and some of the other best practice frameworks are a little bit more expansive, but these are the key topics that you would need to align to in order to fully align with the CCPA cybersecurity audit.
And again, Corey, I just want to chime in for those who may not be accustomed to conducting or participating in these types of audits. For instance, more focused on the privacy side of compliance. These assessment topics are, I think, going to be helpful so that we're not flying blind over what type of reasonable security we're assessing against. I think it's also going to, over time, standardize the audits a bit more. I don't even get a free t-shirt out of saying this, but I have known Corey for a long time, even before MINA was rebranded, and worked with them a long time. And so organizations like Corey's team can really come to the forefront with standardizing this in a way that becomes more accessible and repeatable year after year, so that you're largely looking for what's changed since the prior year, and it's not going to be such a Herculean effort every year. And the regs and guidance point to the ability to sort of leverage your SOC audits and other assessments as long as the scoping is relevant. So I don't think that pure privacy folks are going to have to get up to their neck in these security concepts, but it is going to require cross collaboration. But I think it will be in a good way, one that allows you to memorialize, your comprehensive security for personal information. And for those that are already in regulated industries like healthcare, this is not crazy different from HIPAA and going through the standards for how you protect that regulated data set. But I would say a word of caution that because of this list and some of the attributes, there will be, I think, a lot of vendors that are accredited auditing firms that might try to pivot into this. So you just want to do your due diligence, to make sure that it's not someone brand new to the game that's just trying to monetize through a transactional process, and make sure that they're willing to really dig in and understand your organization and what your goals are and what you want to get out the other end of it before, thinking you're pressing an easy button, because so far none of those would have been endorsed. So if you're thinking you're going to get like a silver or a gold stamp that says that you're CCPA compliant now, those have not been endorsed by the authority in a way that would lead to that type of certificate outcome. So again, nothing against new developments. You have to start somewhere, but I would just do good due diligence to make sure you're not getting some kind of templated process that might not consider variables specific to your organization or your data.
Yeah, thank you. Well said. Okay, so not a lot to internalize here. There are very specific attributes in the regulation that the audit report must include, and you can take a look at them here. I did just want to touch on the last two, because organizations that do assessments and even some audits don't necessarily, you don't have to, and they don't necessarily list the gap management action plans, which are the organization's responses to identified gaps. Like we will fix XYZ by doing the following by a certain date. Not all assessments and audits include that, but the CCPA specifically does need to see that in the audit report. So please keep that in mind. And also that there is an auditor attestation required, certifying completion of an independent review of the business's cybersecurity program.
Yeah, and on that gap management action plan, that's an important note, Corey, because that rather than an exercise that is being done just for compliance reasons and get the report done and kind of file it away, if you take that step and create a map, then you can actually address those gaps and have practical outcomes in terms of your operations falling out of this analysis, which I think is an important thing to call out.
And let's talk just quickly about the certificate of completion. Again, this is also something that the regulation outlines the very specific attributes that have to be there. None of these are earth-shattering, but I think the one that is interesting to me is the very specific language that must be included in every certificate of completion that's submitted, and that's on the fifth bullet. And you can find that in the regulation. Just please note that that needs to be in your certificate of completion that's submitted. And then finally, just wrapping up, there are a couple of important notes that I'd like you to take away from the cybersecurity audit discussion. One, this is good news, but there are a couple of caveats. A business can utilize a cybersecurity audit assessment or evaluation that it has prepared for another purpose, provided that it meets all of the requirements in this article. So that is good news. However, it could come to pass that the audit that or assessment that you've conducted doesn't meet the requirements or even slightly meet the requirements. So some due diligence would need to be done there to determine whether you can or cannot use prior work. It is reasonable to me to conclude that the cybersecurity audit that is now required should be treated like a formal audit. And when I say audit, I mean not like an assessment. And just really quickly, at the highest level of description, an assessment could rely on reviewing policies and procedures and other documentation, as well as discovery sessions. And it even could rely on some very limited non-statistical sampling, like a sample of one, just to get some assurance over the process. Whereas an audit does specifically require population-based sampling and testing. And why do I conclude this? Why do I think this? Well, I guess first and foremost, the activity from in the CCPA specifically does refer to it as an audit. They could have referred to it as an assessment, but they chose this word for a specific reason. So I'm assuming that they wanted to be treated as such. Another reason is that if you recall from prior slides, it does include a 12-month audit period. And in audit world and assessment world, that implies both a test of design of a control as well as a test of effectiveness. And the test of effectiveness means over a period of time, which would mean that sample testing would need to be done based on a population size. And that can add significantly to the cost and the complexity of an audit. And just one final takeaway. If you recall, you have to have that audit completed by April 1st, which means you really only have 3 months to do it. If you're waiting to scope it out, come up with a test plan, get evidence, hold discovery, do your analysis, create the assessment, identify gaps, get a management action plan, as well as any completing the certification. That's not a lot of time, 90 days. It could be very tight. So that's why I wanted to bring up, treating it like an audit. As mentioned, I come from an audit background. I've done a lot of SOX testing. businesses tend to break up their SOX testing into interim testing and roll forward testing. So at maybe the halfway point through the year, you would do some population testing. And then at the closure of the year, you would do testing for the prior 6 months. That takes away a lot of the burden in terms of a very tight timeline. It also gives businesses the opportunity to identify and potentially remediate gaps that might come up in that interim testing for the first 6 months. So, please do keep in mind, how big of an endeavor this might be for you and your organization, and plan accordingly.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Corey. And in the interest of time, I'm going to move right ahead with the last section that we're going to cover today, which is performing risk assessments. And on this, again, for privacy and IT security professionals listening, it's probably not new ground, but we do wanted to mention that this is a significant new requirement in the regulations. So this next slide we wanted to cover just basically to help you within your organization argue for the value of risk assessment, so the value proposition. There are a number of positive outcomes beyond satisfying your compliance requirement that can be realized here and that can help make the argument for dedicating time and resource to doing these risk assessments. One is proactive security, which hopefully is fairly obvious to identify, vulnerabilities and gaps before they become significant incidents that you have to unwind and deal with. Regulatory compliance to just because it needs to be done as a requirement of the law. To get resources aligned, this prioritizes security investments, and it will allow you to have a look at the risks and then be able to say, well, these are lower and we can bear these for a while, but these are high risk and we really should address these right away. So having resources properly aligned within the organization, doing the most important tasks is of course important. So that's can be a positive outcome of the risk assessment activities. Business continuity, boy, these days, especially with ongoing weather results and disruption to operations just due to all kinds of floods, hurricanes, fires, etc., seems to be on the rise. So too often, sadly, business continuity plans and action plans get pushed off to the side, and this can bring them up to the fore so they can actually get addressed. And importantly, especially if you're in a B2C business, stakeholder confidence builds trust with your customers, your partners, your vendors, and the regulators to let them know that you're doing your due diligence. So a lot of just 5 very important reasons why they're positive outputs from conducting these risk assessments. If we can move on to the next slide, please.
Dave, just really quickly with the other value propositions, doing those things and formalizing them, even if they're operationally existing, formalizing these will also reduce your risk associated with a data breach, liability from related litigation and similar. So and it could also impact your cyber insurance, and many other aspects just by doing these things for the new regulations, but creates a proactive path for overall reduction of cost and liability risk.
Tara, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because at Mina, when we conduct these risk assessments for our clients, we evaluate them both on policy and procedures. So oftentimes an organization might have a procedure in place and they're actually doing it, but they just don't have it documented anywhere. So we help identify that and take the time to actually formally document those processes. Other times it's the opposite, and there are written formal documents in place, but the procedure is just not operational and needs to be put into action. So really, really good call out there, and especially with the policy documentation for regulatory due diligence. I'm glad you've mentioned that. So in terms of kind of a workflow for this, kind of want to walk through this really, really quickly. It's very important to limit the scope, honestly, to make it a doable exercise. It can be very overwhelming. Again, our clients often bring us in to help as a third party to help them define what is in scope and what is out of scope. And it's very important to define what's out of scope so that you can handle your most high-risk activities and departments. So starting off there is really important. Getting the cross-functional department or team input and buy-in in order to uncover what's actually happening within the organization. You have to have those relationships built up, that trust built up through discovery sessions, and understanding the importance of these exercises. Creating an ongoing and living dynamic inventory of your data is something that some organizations have done, but many have not. Again, we spend a lot of time with our clients working on this. And once the big lift is done and the foundation is created, then updating it becomes a much easier task once the initial lift is taken place. That allows you to do that threat analysis, to identify potential internal and external threats to your data stores, as you can put those controls in place if they're not already, or tighten them up if they need tightening up, keeping up to date with technological advances. Understanding the potential impact to data breaches and system failures is a ability to future forecast and kind of do scenarios, tabletop exercises, etc., that help understand if something bad is to happen, how will we react? And the time to be doing that is before something bad happens, not while something bad is happening, as too many organizations have found out the hard way. So, and finally, as Tara just mentioned, documentation is really important to be able to kind of put that all down on paper for institutional history, institutional consistency. People come and go, and when you have it written down, the new people that are coming in can pick it up and be able to run with it right away. And then lastly, our last slide here, this is, it's too often we see organizations that do a big lift and do this once and say, we're kind of done, wipe our hands, one and done. But as anyone who's been through this before knows, it's very important to establish a cadence whereby you are regularly revisiting this. And it becomes the second time around, third time around, fourth time around, it becomes much, much easier after the initial lift. So that's a very important thing to note and to establish that cadence. Utilizing the great technology, all kinds of great software platforms are out there to help automate and make tasks a lot easier. Of course, the AI revolution we're all undergoing every single day is literally revolutionary, and it's going to provide a lot of ability to streamline workflows. None of this gets done and none of this is effective without ongoing employee training and awareness. So establishing a good regular way to keep people up to date on what needs to be done, what the risk indicators are, how to report back up to and who is extremely important. And creating the audit trail so that you can document what you've done, what you're planning on doing, and having a nice ability to show the iterations that you've made, the changes and improvements that you've made is critically important. And lastly, just always seeking to refine and improve, continuous improvement as you're moving through this cycle over time, to continually look for places where you can gain efficiencies, improve something, make it just a little bit better is really critical.
And on that last point, it probably goes without saying, but you'd be surprised how often it happens. You don't want to have a risk assessment report or a security report with red findings all over it that sits that way for 8-9 months without taking some steps to mitigate or reduce the risk. Because if you have that report become discoverable by the regulator, or even in litigation associated with a breach or something, then it's going to be problematic that you were fully aware of it and didn't take steps reasonably to mitigate it. So be aware of that too, that when you go to do the security assessment or even the risk assessments, if you haven't yet taken any steps and there's going to be lots of low-hanging fruit, try to maybe mitigate that before you do the formal assessment so that you're not just identifying things that you already know need to be rectified, because that will bode better for the overall posture of that report. Not in a misleading way, but if it's low-hanging fruit, just remediate it before you pay for the assessment.
Exactly. Such an important point. And yeah, if you identify the gap and you document it and leave it there and then it sits for this extended amount of time, you're actually creating legal liability, and that's not what you want to do. Back to Corey's point earlier in his last bullet on that slide about creating a gap action plan. It's really important to take action on these identified gaps. So with that, I wanted to move over to our discussion. We just have a few minutes left in the hour. Thank you all for staying with us, and I hope that everybody's gained a lot of good insight into what needs to be done to come up into compliance in these with these new CCPA requirements. And speaking of the risk assessments, the section that we just kind of finished off on, one of the things that as I was looking through this that I was kind of wondering about are what kinds of resources are going to be made available to businesses that want to do their due diligence, comply with these risk assessment requirements in terms of the format for how these are submitted. And Tara, I was wondering if you had any kind of thoughts on that. I didn't, on initial discovery, didn't find any published templates or formats necessary required yet from the CPPA. It would be interesting to see if those become available to people that they can use, or whether it's going to be up to businesses to come up with their own formats. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I haven't seen that yet either, but I do anticipate that becoming a trend, even if it's not officially blessed. I feel like some examples may present themselves, or maybe there's some regulatory scrutiny where we see where deficiencies are in those artifacts, so that we know how to better present or capture what's being evaluated in the security audit or the risk assessment. But the CPPA in particular, like you mentioned, is full of very savvy technical experts, and they continue to produce content online and as informal resources through LinkedIn and otherwise that really give good insights and guidance. And it wouldn't surprise me if over time something similar evolves, or across industries, there just begins, as often occurs, sort of a trend in adapting a standardized format, because the concepts, under the security assessment are calling for very specific types of controls, and the evaluation methods for the risk assessment are spelled out. So I think it will lend itself to developing a common approach and appearance.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then in these final minutes that we have here, Corey, back to you. Speaking of the point that we're just mentioning about identifying the legal liability potentially inherent in identifying risks and then not acting on them, it may seem overwhelming for some businesses to get kind of lists of gaps or controls that need to be put into place, and then figure out how to prioritize them. But can you speak a little bit to your experience working with clients in terms of how do we do that? Is it possible to kind of create some kind of a heat map or roadmap that kind of prioritizes the different gaps and which ones should be addressed first, and might be lighter lifts or heavier lifts than others? Or how do we help people kind of think about that and get their arms around it, that work?
Yeah, so from an assessment perspective, a lot of judgment would need to be used. For example, using NIST or ISO as an example, it doesn't give priority of any controls over others. So I would recommend that understanding the business and its operations and its risk, its threat environment, and any known vulnerabilities, that the management, the business's team that is evaluating the results of the assessment, use its knowledge of the institution and the environment to prioritize the remediation. And indeed, all of the gaps identified would need to be remediated. Obviously, the assessment has a lot of gaps. Not everything can be remediated overnight. So coming up with a risk-based remediation plan goes a long way, not just in starting the process of remediation, but demonstrating to California that we understand we have gaps. We have a plan. We've come together as an organization. We've assessed them in terms of risk, and here is our plan to remediate them over time.
Terrific. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks very much, Corey. And with that, we're just about out of time. As you can see on the screen in front of you, the contact information for all three of us is there. Please feel free to reach out with questions or comments. Hope we've provided some good value for you here on the program today, and we'll be more than happy to follow up with anybody. So feel free to reach out to us and contact us. And if you'd like a copy of the slides, we're more than happy to make them available to you as well. So please just reach out and we can get a PDF of the presentation materials over to you quickly so that you can use them as a reference material. Again, we hope we've provided some value for you within this hour. And thanks very much, Corey and Tara, for your time and energy, both in putting together the program and delivering it for folks today. I hope we've provided some good information to move forward with these requirements. So with that, I'll go ahead and take us to a program close. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and we'll see you on the next program. Have a great rest of the day and rest of the week.